Well, welcome back to another episode. This time it's the Volvo XC60 on the miles driven. Interesting one, this car. A lot of you asked for it, and I think it's because the XC90, although it's very popular, I seem to find from your feedback that a lot of you buy the XC60. So while the XC90 sort of interests you, and many of you do go for it, there is a large portion of you that got sort of pulled into Volvo SUVs by looking at an XC90. Maybe you had a first generation, and then once the XC60 arrived, that's kind of taken your business ever since. However, I know there's a lot of you that are sort of in between different cars, and when you look at the XC60, it sits in a really odd place in the car world because you can line up, for most manufacturers, exactly where a competitor sits. So, I'm going to give you the example. Months and months ago, I did a Volvo S90 buyer's guide, and in that I said, okay, this is like an S-Class competitor, and people said, no, it's an E-Class competitor, you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yes, well, the S80, the previous model that Volvo had, their biggest luxury car, was only the size of the E-Class Mercedes. When they released the S90 and V90, they said in their press release, we want to try and get that a little bit more larger market. We want to move the Volvo range upward. But they didn't fully do it. So they said one thing. Car journalists in different countries, in different places, kind of positioned it in different places depending on its price. And Volvo do this with their SUVs because if you look at the XC90, you'd think, okay, well, that's a large SUV. That would be like a Range Rover competitor. But the Range Rover goes up against the BMW X7 now, Mercedes GLS, Audi Q7. Q7 has always been a larger vehicle. So if the XC90 is competing against them and the S90 is on that same chassis, then you'd think it would be an S-Class competitor. But the XC90 usually competes with the X5 BMW and the Mercedes GLE. Audi Q5 is probably more this XC60 competitor. And because of all of this, what happens is, for a lot of people, they get kind of confused where to position a Volvo. Is an XC90 a very large SUV? Is it a large SUV but not the very, very biggest you can buy in most markets? Or is the XC60 sort of filling a space where it goes against sort of like BMW X3 and Audi Q5? The answer is that Volvo kind of end up positioning themselves in between everyone. And so because of that, what I would say is if you're looking at an SUV from Volvo, probably you don't want to exactly position it against another vehicle. So for example, an X5 is probably quite a bit larger, but if you've seen the latest X3 generation model, you'd say, that is like the old BMW X5 size. So there isn't really the clear delineation that there used to be, and this happens across Volvo's range. They've always been a slight sort of outside runner on this, where people have tried to say, well, this car is like this one, but then it kind of isn't. And a lot of this has to do with how cars have got much larger. As I said, if you go back 25 years, you had the Range Rover, you had the BMW X5. There's two cars, XC90 goes against them. Mercedes had the ML class. Since then, some of these cars have got much larger. The Range Rover, for example, has got much wider, not any taller, but wider. The X5 has kind of stayed around the same size. It has grown a bit, but the X3 underneath it has grown, and the X7 has then filled up the top space. Whereas Volvo kind of said, well, we want the XC60 to stay in its true market. We don't really want an XC60 that morphs into the size of something bigger than our previous XC90, and then the XC90 has to be some sort of rolling tank going down the road. So because of all of that, a lot of you have said, yes, it's the XC90 that really interests you. The XC60 that really interests you. So let's start. Generation 1 vehicle. Now, a prototype comes out, I think this is around 2007, the prototype concept vehicle. From there, they managed to get quite, I'd say, a good variety of engines, but it depends where you are in the world. Now, I'll come on to engines in just a second, and I will let you know all XC60s, so first generation and second generation, they have a buyer's guide on this channel. So if you watch this video and you think, I really wanted a few more technical details, what to look for, that sort of stuff, good news, you can click on the buyer's guide Gen 1 or Gen 2 and you'll know a lot more. But this will give you a good overview, especially when it comes to specification, because early on, first cars, you've got SE. For most of you, that will be the base model. However, some of you will have a base below an SE, which will just be the designation of the engine. So sort of, T5, T4, D3, D2, D4, D5. It's an odd one because Volvo do different things in different markets, but for many of you, you'll have that as an engine designation, and then you'll be able to pick your specification next to it. But in other markets, they remove a specification entirely, and you can just have like a D3 model. Now, you have SE, you have at the top, you have the R design, but the R design can come in several different specifications, so like nav and things like that, and sport and whatever. Inscription, momentum, and SE starts, I'd say the SE range is about that large. So you've got SE, SE nav, SEL, SE luxury, SE executive, SE technology, I think was one of them as well. Quite a long list, and again, market dependent. Really, what you should know is if you're looking at SE, for most of you, SE will probably be around the base spec. R design, I should probably do it the other way, shouldn't I? SE will be base spec around here, and something R design will be in the higher echelons, if we should say, of specification on this Gen 1 model. Now, for many of you, there will be the diesel engines, and I'm going to come on to them in just a minute, because I think, personal experience actually, if you had the diesel in your market, you bought it. That was the general rule with the diesel. It's just they had the 5-cylinder diesel on this generation. People loved that. But they also had the 4-cylinder diesel, which meant people who had to buy them on company leases or whatever other sort of business lease when they were new had an option to get them as well. So the diesel is very popular. But let's cover the petrol engines first, because that way, we've started with the ones that, for some of you, especially if you're in the US, that will be the majority of your options. But for the rest of the world, probably leans a little bit more diesel in this first generation. So B42, B52 and B63. Those are the engine codes. They don't need to mean anything to you. Basically, you've got a 2-litre 4-cylinder, a 2.5 5-cylinder, and then the big one, the 3-litre 6-cylinder. Advice on it, the 2-litre, people seem to like that. I'm just trying to think if there's anything that would be like horrendous, like bring this up and tell them this thing breaks or that thing doesn't. But actually on the 2-litre, I've seen, just trying to think, the highest mileage, probably around 140,000 miles I've seen on one of these with just service history, no repairs on it. Generally speaking, owners seem to quite like the 2-litre. However, because the larger engines exist, and because this is sort of before the period we live in today, where sort of it's downsizing, turbocharging, everything should be as small as possible with as least cylinders as possible, and the longevity argument that used to exist, especially with Volvos, has kind of been moved off to the side. However, in this generation, that is still paramount, especially on a lot of people who are buying Volvo's minds. And so the 5-cylinder and the 6-cylinder, that's going to be where there is a lot on the used market. Now, the 6-cylinder, the best way of looking at that is it's a real favourite of some Volvo fans. Unfortunately, on the other side of it's the turbocharged 6-cylinder, then you've got the issue that it will be the highest cost of repair. Okay, so just bear that in mind. If you go for a T6, yes, the T6 will have highest power, highest specification most time, but it's also got 6 cylinders. That's 6 cylinders to maintain, so 6 spark plugs every time you need a service. It's also going to need more oil in it because it's a larger engine, etc., etc. So there are little bits of costs that go with that are going to be higher. Critically, if there's something wrong with it, it's going to probably need a larger repair. Now with the 5-cylinder, you're getting a little bit of the Volvo magic, if you like, because 5-cylinder engines really are not associated with many manufacturers at all across the entire world. So Audi have a 5-cylinder and they have sort of a history with a 5-cylinder. Volvo have a 5-cylinder. Mercedes did have a 5-cylinder for a little while on one of their diesel engines. And then if you go back in time, historically, we just don't really see 5-cylinders. It's an odd number to have. You're an inline engine, and generally speaking, people go, well, if we can do the same job with 4, or we have 5. But there is this, it's a great thought really, that it's like redundancy, if you like. If you have 5 cylinders, you're putting less stress across the run of the engine. You are creating an imbalance within the engine because you've got 5 cylinders instead of 4. So you've always got a middle piston that's sort of moving in between. However, that gives it a unique sound, but also a unique power distribution. It's really difficult because it's not unbalanced like a V6 or a V8 with a crossplane crank would have on it. And I know that might be a bit too difficult, but if you've ever revved a V8 or a V6 or a V12 or a V10 a bit so less so, but just because of how they're engineered, they'll sort of wobble, they'll warble, and that's what people love about them. A, the sound, but B, the way they'll sit in a chassis is they don't. If you rev a 4-cylinder, you'll sort of get this tension from the engine, so it'll try and move itself forward on its engine mounts. Once you go to 5-cylinder, it will still do that, but it just has that bit more torque behind it, and you can almost see it sort of unbalances it slightly. With a V6 and a V8, this is much more obvious. You can see it does that. It will warble off to the sides because it's trying to get something that is naturally a bit less balanced to get moving. Once it's up to, well, once it breaks inertia, then it's a different story. But it's why people love V8s. And so it gives the car sort of a unique sound and a unique power delivery, and it's really like a thrusting motion. Now that's what people love about the 5-cylinder petrol engine on this. They particularly love it on the 5-cylinder diesel, and I will come to that in a moment. The one thing to consider is that whilst the 5-cylinder petrols have been taken 200,000 miles with maintenance, they also can develop a small issue. I say a small issue, quite a big issue actually, where the cylinder walls are not that thick between. You're getting 5 cylinders into this space, and you can have cooling issues. The jackets or the slits in between the cylinders were not that deep on the early ones. They made them deeper later on to try and get around this issue. Generally speaking, it's not. I wouldn't say it's a big issue like there are on some engines. So I would look for it if I was going to buy one, but it wouldn't be something that put me off in any way, because it'd be fairly obvious if it had a major issue. The only trouble you ever had, and I had this exact issue on a 5-cylinder of this, if piston 3 has an issue, you've got the other 2 pistons sort of balancing each other off. And so if piston 3 has decompression, it's much harder to spot on a test drive, because although the car will be slightly underpowered, unless you really know what you're looking for, it won't be as obvious as if, say, you drove a 6-cylinder and one piston on either side or around the engine wasn't absolutely perfect from a compression point of view. That all might be a bit too technical. The big point here is that many people love the 5-cylinder. It's the one I really love, and it's the one I would certainly look at, but I'd probably just try and look at 2 if I was going to. However, there is an engine that's offered on this. It's not the most efficient, but it's kind of a real loved engine, and it's a 3.2 6-cylinder, naturally aspirated, and it's kind of got this view of it. If you get that in a Volvo, what you've essentially got is a vehicle that can take you to the end of time. That's kind of the viewpoint of it. Yes, a 4-cylinder would be more efficient. Yes, a turbocharger would make it more powerful, but having a 3.2 inline 6 engine in an XC60 is kind of one of those doomsday vehicles in a way of, well, I can put it there, service it religiously, but service it, keep it fresh, keep it with fresh tyres and brakes, and run it off to the moon, basically. I've seen some of these with like 280,000 miles in Europe, not in the UK. I don't think we got them in the UK, and if we did, we certainly wouldn't have bought them very much. But yeah, in Europe, I'm saying 280 because I'm having to put in my head it back from kilometres. But yeah, so this was a popular pick by many, and I'm sure there'll be some owner out there who's found this video who's got a 3.2 inline 6, and they kind of you almost feel in the Volvo community like you've lost out, because you could have gone for a 5-cylinder turbo, you could have gone for the 6-cylinder turbo, that top spec engine, and you went for the inline 6, and everyone says, well, it's not as powerful, it's not as efficient, so why did you buy it? It's like, well, this one really, you're never having to worry about turbochargers failing. Okay, you're never having to worry about the additional cooling that you need to turbocharge an engine having an issue. Really, it's just one of those engines that, as long as it's been well kept, should just keep you going. And I think I say something very similar to that on the buyer's guide. So that is this first generation of petrol engines. Let's cover the diesels though, so I know that's the one many of you are waiting for. And I'll give you a quick word of warning. Some people think that if a car is badged D5, that's the only time you'll get it with a 5-cylinder. It's not actually true. The 5-cylinder is fitted in D3, D4 and D5 specification. Okay, so the 2 engines are D42, D52. So it's easier from remembering the engine codes from this. If it's a D52, it's a 2.45 cylinder. If it's a D42, it's a 2-litre 4-cylinder. However, Volvo are great at really engineering everything to the nth. And so there's like 15 to 20 variations of this engine, and I am not kidding. Depending on where you live in the world and depending on what market you are in, you really could have a ginormous variation. And it comes down to power, to emissions, to what they needed at the time of a facelift. All these other things come into it. And there's also twin turbocharging versus single turbocharging. So there's a lot going on. What I would say is 2.4 5-cylinder diesel. A family member with one, they're going to run that thing until it doesn't run anymore, and that could be a very, very, very long time. They've already had it for like 10 years, and it's just run. That engine, I had a friend's dad had it about 3 times in different Volvos, and each time he bought the car with just giant mileage on. Any other car would be worth nothing with the mileage he was buying. I think it was like 160,000 miles. Most cars at that point are just sort of, they're long in the tooth. Not a 5-cylinder diesel Volvo that's been serviced and kept. And he just ran it on. I think it got up to sort of 280. Actually, I remember at one point going to my friend's house. They probably won't thank me for saying this, but I'll tell you the story. He bought it was an S60 that he ran, and then he bought another S60 that had an engine issue, and that then just became a donor vehicle. So if anything needed changing, or there was something a bit nicer on the other one, just swap it over on the weekend, and eventually the other one got taken away. I think they took the engine out of it as well, so they had extra parts. But the one I quite like is the 202. So there's sort of 2 variations. You've got slightly higher horsepower, about 220, and then just over 200. And although the 220 is very tempting because it's more powerful, so why not? The 200 horsepower or 203 horsepower 5-cylinder is the one that, you're trying to look at a longevity point of view. And so you're looking at from the first owner to you, why did people buy the car? And as much as we're really talking in the margins here, so I wouldn't say one's been driven to the nines and the other one has been driven like Miss Daisy, and so you can go for this one. It's not going to be that. It's small margins variations. If you want one with sort of slightly nicer specification, maybe you want one that has been long-term owned by one owner and then another. From what I've seen, and this is anecdotal, so it may be a different story for you, it's generally that the one that's sort of 200-ish horsepower gets a little bit of a longer ownership. And generally the ones that are slightly higher powered, they're going in against people who would usually change a car every 2-3 years. Maybe they've had BMW, Mercedes, whatever, Audi before, and they think, oh, I'll have a Volvo for a couple of years, and they like it, but they're not a Volvo enthusiast. They're not part of the Volvo community in that way. So don't think, oh, I've got something great. They just think, oh yeah, nice, yeah, it drives nice, and then, they switch to, say, a 6-cylinder BMW diesel or something like that, because that caught their eye. On the 2-litre, people will, if you've got a 5-cylinder, people sort of will just say, no, you bought the wrong engine if you go for a 2-litre one. I wouldn't look at it that way. There is always going to be reports of emissions equipment issues on these engines, okay? Diesel engines with high levels of emissions equipment and filters and everything else on them are always more prone to have issues. But you will find a lot of people talk about them online. Does that mean that they're happening every 5 minutes? No. And so I'd probably watch the guide on this one, and I'd make your mind up from that, because what you'll most likely find is that a 2-litre diesel specification will be more limiting for you than actually sort of the power or everything else that you want from it. Because if you're looking at it and you say, well, I really want an inscription model, and I really want it in blue, and I would like it with the optional wheels, that will probably limit you a lot more than saying, I want a 2-litre. So go into it in whichever way is sort of best for you. But if you can, I would, especially if this is a long-term purchase. So a few of you actually, that reached out and said, oh, can you do an XC60 video on this? And I was like, yeah. And every time it was kind of, I'm looking to buy either a long-term car, a car I just want to keep forever, or I don't want to go EV. That's what I get quite a bit of feedback on the website, on the Miles Driven website for that, which is, I don't want to go EV, but I don't know if we will go EV, because who knows what's going to happen in the next 5 years. And so what would you suggest if I want to have something for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years? Now, of course, the Japanese stuff does sort of go to the top of the list if you're just looking for absolute longevity. However, I can tell you from selling Japanese cars brand new, used, and being around that community and then working in classics, the engines are gone forever. But that doesn't mean the chassis and the shell and the suspension will go on forever. And it's usually the sort of compromising factor, especially if you're buying a car that is Japanese market and you're bringing it to a, like Northern Europe or even sort of mid-Europe, the UK, sort of the top half of the US and then into Canada, because you're going to have weather factors that will have an impact on those cars. Now, yes, there's loads of things you can do for that, but generally speaking, if you're buying from Volvo, especially in this generation, and I really need to stress that, especially in this generation, you are buying from people. I've met a few of these engineers. They're thinking like this: what could destroy it? What could break it? What moose hitting it would take it out? What snowy conditions will it need to work in? It could be minus 35 up in Umeå or something, and someone's needing to get in from the Arctic Circle all the way down to Stockholm that morning, and they need to leave at 4 a.m. and it's minus 35 outside. They're thinking of all these. They've had to put something additional in their tank to make sure that the diesel doesn't freeze overnight. They're going to be running on gritted roads or unsealed roads, and this is the sort of mind that they were going through in Volvo at this time, and it's what made Volvo up to now. I don't want to get too critical of Volvo today because I don't think that's necessary, but certainly there was an element in time that Volvo built their history on, and it was making so that cars could get long distances in the worst possible conditions safely to their destination. That's really what you're getting one of these for. And so if you showed me something like a 5-cylinder diesel or one of the petrol ones with 200,000 miles that still looked great, but you looked underneath it and you went, wow, it's lived a life, but everything's intact, I'd say it doesn't surprise me. Other way around, if you said it with Japanese, not to criticize Japanese, some cars are really well suited to that sort of colder environment, especially some of the, when I sold Mazdas, I think it was the Mazda, it was either the 3 or the 6, I can't quite remember, but that was actually European designed. So when they were coming up with the inception, they weren't thinking of the climates that they have of unsalted roads or unsealed roads that it may take on. They were thinking of that in Europe. So just something to keep in your mind, especially on this first generation. Now, let's move into the second generation, 2017. It's much easier for me from an engine point of view because from where we had all this variation before, we now really just go to 3 variations of engine. And this one is a bit easier for me to speak about from a specification because Volvo actually call their base model the Core. However, that is for the facelift models. So if you're buying a Core model, you're buying a base model. Then you've got the R design that you had before, Momentum, Inscription. They have then the Ultra model and they have the Ultimate model. Okay, so specification is a bit clearer on the second generation than it is the first. If you're just coming into the Volvo world, and you're not really familiar with it all, R Design is still up at the top, and there are still words like R Design Pro, R Design Nav, things like that. So be aware that if you see one particular, like even Ultra, there's Ultra, Ultra Dark, I think there's Ultimate, Ultimate Dark, I think. So just bear in mind that there are sort of levels within levels for specification, okay? But on a broad strokes, Core at the bottom, you've got your Momentum, Inscription, you've got then say into your R designs, and then sort of your Ultra and Ultimate, depending on your market, and then within that, sort of there'll be some special models. There's the Ocean Race on both generations as well, but you're really going to struggle to find one of those. So just as a side note on specification. Now, engines is actually, there's no point in me splitting petrol and diesel, although I will talk about the hybrids separately. So petrol, B42, diesel, D42. 2 engines, 2 2-litre engines. Interesting point and something to remember. If you see the word Powerpulse, okay, that is going to be the diesel variant. So the initial engines are called Powerpulse. It was to do with an inlet system on the engine that it created, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. It's probably a bit like what a mild hybrid system would do today, but it was a mechanical way of doing it, maybe a poor way of explaining it. I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm way off, but that's sort of my best sort of short explanation of it. Maybe it needs a whole video to itself, the Powerpulse system, but it can break. And in fact, I think in every single guide that I've done, I'm just trying to think now, I think every guide that I've done with a Powerpulse engine, and I've said, look out, it could have XY issues. So just bear that in mind on this one. Now, petrol and diesel. Petrol's a 2-litre turbo. Diesel is a 2-litre turbo. I think there's some twin turbos if you go up on the specification. And I think really, from what I know of these, the engine you get is going to be very market dependent. If you're in Europe, the majority is going to be a 2-litre diesel. However, we all know what happens to the world in sort of 2017, 18, 19, where the view on diesel shifts. And because of that, then the petrol will be much more popular. However, because there's a hybrid, it skews all of these figures. I'm just talking about the engine itself at the moment. There is a hybrid system, but the hybrid system, which is called T8, or they put H at the end of the specifications. Some places they just call it hybrid. That is a hybrid system onto the petrol engine. Okay, so you don't need to think of it as 3 engines. You can kind of think there's a petrol and a petrol hybrid, same motor fitted with then electric motors and with the battery, and then just a diesel sat on its own. Let's talk of the diesel first, because we'll do it backwards this time, because there's more to say on the petrols. With the diesel engine, a lot of people like it, and people have run it quite far. Some people criticise them. They want multiple cylinders. They want the longevity of the previous generation, and I do not blame them, because being able to buy a car and knowing that you can get on with all the other things that are happening in your life and not have to think, oh, well, the car's it's doing a bit of mileage now. Oh, I really need to get in and think about changing it and start the research and watching videos or reading reviews and everything else. Some people just don't want to do that in life, and I completely understand that. They just want to worry about their hobbies, their family, their friends, and do whatever they need to do. That's the previous generation XC60. In this generation, it's built with a good amount of longevity in mind, but the idea that you can keep these for sort of 300,000 miles, yes, you can, but you're going to be probably buying additional engine ancillaries and equipment that you wouldn't be necessarily buying on the old ones. That could be a bit unfair, but for example, turbocharged engine. Like I said before, if you buy a naturally aspirated 3.2, it's probably just going to keep running forever. If you're buying one with a turbocharger, turbochargers by their very design wear. Okay, if you don't know how they are or what they are or how they work, I won't go into a great detail on, but you've basically got impeller on the inlet side, impeller on the exhaust side. One is spinning up the other. You've got ball bearings in there, and you're basically using the inlet side impeller to force more engine to get into the cylinders, because to combust fuel you need air, and the more air you've got, the more sort of bang for your buck you can get, if you look at it that way. And you're using the speed of the exhaust gases to spin up an impeller. So you're kind of getting this on the inlet side, this like free sped up air by using the exhaust, which is why manufacturers love it in comparison to, say, superchargers, which are parasitic. So they use the engine's momentum that it already has to then spin themselves up. So you get instant power because you're not waiting for the exhaust gases to spin this impeller, speed this impeller up. But of course, it comes at a cost. Now, that may all be a bit too technical for most people, so don't worry. Here's what I would say. That very design means that turbochargers eventually, no matter how good they are and how well they've been designed, will need either rebuilding or replacing. It's just a fact, okay? I don't think I've seen, outside of, say, like a truck, that runs sort of hundreds of thousands of miles, and so then has different engineering behind it, different longevity built into it. For cars, manufacturers are very seldom sacrificing power and efficiency for reliability. There is a crossover point, okay? But if your vehicle makes you money and you have to have it on the road, engineers will be giving that reliability factor that higher sort of concentration than they will if it's, we're trying to release our new car. We need the marketing team to say it's better than XYZ manufacturers. So, you can't just say, oh, it's more reliable, it will last for 20 years, because the first buyers probably don't care. They probably just want it for 2 years, enjoy it, and get rid of it. And so there is that. And that's not manufacturers' fault. That's the world we live in. That's the market we have. But it's something to bear in mind. By then its design, you have to then cool the turbocharger. You have to have different systems around it for cooling. I don't want to go too technical on this one, because I think I'll lose you all into an engine specific conversation. But the point being, yes, you should get, say, 125 to 150,000 miles out of a diesel engine. And to be honest, even though the petrol engine revs higher, that's kind of what I'm seeing from them as well. Before you start to need additional repairs done. With the diesel, it is usually that their emissions equipment starts to need changing, because running a filter and an exhaust, which is what a DPF, by the way, if you've heard the term DPF and you don't know what it is, that is a filter in your exhaust system. Gases are coming into the filter and they're being captured by it. Okay, it then does it a clean of itself as much as it can when you then sort of pick up speed, and it can then sort of cleanse some of these exhaust gases, the ones we really don't like. There's AdBlue systems. That's a way of treating those exhaust gases so that when they are released, they have been treated to reduce the effect of some of the particles that are coming out of an exhaust. However, all of those systems wear. Okay, so at some point, 120, 130, 140,000 miles, they're going to have run all that time and said, okay, that's it, I can't do my job anymore. And you'll go for your emissions test or your annual test or whatever you go for, and they'll say, yeah, that's done. And it's going to be a fairly expensive repair. Now, that existed on the previous generation as well. It's just that for many countries, the emissions equipment standard was not as high as it is in the second generation. So there's a little bit of, they haven't had to be built as strictly. Okay, so they're not trying to capture as much because that's not what the requirements asked of them. Also a larger engine, etc., etc. But the point being that both the petrol and the diesel engine, once it gets to around that sort of 120, 130, 140,000 mile in these 2 litres, will probably need some form of maintenance or repair. However, it's probably worth doing, because after that we are seeing from owner reports that they just do keep going, you know, and that's a really good indication of their longevity. And so from there, let's talk about the twin engine model, because we've kind of covered the petrol there. I think for a lot of you in this generation, you're going to be looking at twin engine or the hybrid model. For a lot of you, you'll have T6 and T8. They're just 2 specifications, 2 power outputs, about 11.5 kilowatt hour battery, 25 to 30 miles of range, so sort of 40 to 50 kilometers of range. Some people get a tiny bit more. A lot of people get less, depending on time of year as well and where you live. If you live in the freezing cold, it's going to be less than if you live in a sort of mild state of the US, or if you live in maybe the south of England or something where really it's only a month or 6 weeks of the year that you get particularly cold weather. I'll say that now, and there'll be like an ice storm come across the whole of the south of the UK. If you live in, I was going to try and pick a part of Australia there that isn't always, I suppose Melbourne, you know, yeah, they've got fairly sort of a warmer but mild climate, so you probably get really good range out of them there. Sydney, you're sort of stepping up heat a little bit, but this is the problem whenever I talk about hybrids, you've got to take weather into account, and you do on petrol and diesel engines as well. However, you can ask truck drivers and say, what variants do you see in your diesel engine across the year? And they will tell you, you know, diesel engines don't particularly like freezing cold weather. That's not their sort of favourite of operating in. They don't mind sort of mild weather, and they can go up to sort of hotter weather. But particularly freezing cold they don't like, and they will use a bit more fuel during that time. In this one, it's an odd one, because when these came out, they had 11.5 kilowatt hour batteries, okay, which at the time was quite a reasonable size to have as a plug-in hybrid vehicle. So if you think about the time of like Nissan Leaf sort of thing, and a couple of the other BMW i3, they had sort of 50-ish kilowatt hour variants, and they're fully electric. Okay, we've got much more used to today seeing electric cars with about 70, 80 kilowatts, although you do still get new cars today with sort of 50-ish kilowatt hours battery. To have 11 means you've kind of got a fifth of what a full electric vehicle has. That sounds quite a lot when you've got an engine doing a job anyway, you know, and this is kind of just to top you up. However, we now live in the world where some cars are getting 25, 30 kilowatt hour hybrid systems. And that's because we're in a bit of a transition phase where, you know, they want to bump up the amount of electric range you can do. People don't want to quite give up the flexibility of an engine. Volvo themselves, what's the new? I think the XC90, the latest one, is around 20 kilowatt hour battery. In fact, the XC90 on this generation that was running, it started with 11, moved up to, I started with 10, moved up to 11, went up to 14, 17 actually, I think. Now sort of like 21, 22, something like that. The point there is that obviously the bigger the battery, the more range you got from new. difficulty for you is if you're looking to buy used, batteries, as we know, over time, you can see this in your mobile phone. You use it for 2 years, the battery life that you had when it was new is not the same as you had 2 years on. Okay. These cars with 11 kilowatt hour batteries, so you've got quite a large battery if you compare it to things like phones and other electronics. So they do have a bit more management behind them as well. They've got their own computers really trying to manage their thermal load and trying to sort of say, right, now we need to try and keep the capacity as best as possible. However, they are in a car, okay? And that does mean that the use case has an effect. And so when you're looking at a hybrid one, A, I'd want to see it fully charged, and B, I'd want to actually get a good amount of miles done on the battery to see if the computer just hasn't got used to putting a higher mileage there and wiping it all out very quickly. Okay, it's just a good way to buy a hybrid car, in any car really. These ones, they're powerful. Okay, if you get them with a hybrid system, and they're notably powerful, they're more powerful than any of the engine variations. And because the hybrid system can kick in and help the petrol engine if needs be, if you've got used to, say, a turbo 6-cylinder on the previous generation, you're probably going to need to look at the hybrid on this one, because otherwise it is going to feel like a step down power-wise. Okay, that's just something from personal experience, kind of in those shoes. It's the difficulty of how we used to create power and how we now create power in different models. So there's a buyer's guide for this, but things to look out for: few reports of ERAD system failures, but I don't think it would stop me buying one. And on these models, I think the difficulty is on hybrids, they kind of start out, particularly if you're looking 2017, 2018, there was this push from the manufacturers to sort of just get them out there. And because they were going to be more expensive cars, they pushed them with a little bit lower specification, because that way you could kind of balance off, well, it's cheaper as a specification vehicle, but we've started to put the battery in so we can charge then a bit more money. And it's if you're looking at 2017, 2018, and you live in a market with good diesel options, that may swing you if you're looking for a particular specification, or if you go and see a few of them and really condition it is absolutely important to you. You want something that's been really kept well, then you may have to keep your mind open to both. Once we step past sort of 2019 into 20, the specification on the hybrids for the majority of markets does sort of step up to start to a bit higher up the range. And because of that, prices will reflect it, but like anything, larger supply matches the demand. It means that the prices don't go what's in economics called supernormal. They step more into the normal range. And so, you had a higher amount, and that's 19 going into 20. We know what happens in 2020. So that supply then does slow down until 2023. I will add in just a little bit of information, and that is that if you want a 1-year-old vehicle, so 2024, Volvo saw a massive increase in sales in 2024. Okay, it was across the line, and I think it was because they said they were basically going to go full electric for 25. And so a lot of people who had liked their Volvos from previous generations said, oh, I don't want to give up a Volvo, but I don't want one of your new electric ones. And so they said, right, I'll just buy one in 2024. So now that we know that's not the case, and Volvo sort of walked that statement back, those people may have changed to a 25, or possibly towards the end of this year, a 26 model year. And if they do, you might be able to find one in 24, and there is a big supply of them. So you might be able to get a really good deal there. If they're a little bit too much for you though, interestingly in 21, this is probably due just how the supply lines worked, there was a bump in production. Okay, so where 2019 is sort of up to, in fact, in Volvo history, I think 2019 was a really, really good year for Volvo. That's probably when they started their first conversations about going full EV. So people really started to get in 2019. As I say, 2020, we know what happens. But in 21, there is then an initial bump from the drop in 2020. So if you're looking more recent on this one, you can go 24, 21, 2019, and in 2017 and 18 kind of draw, because I think 17 is not a full sales year. So although there's a lot of demand for the new model, it's not a full sales year, and it kind of equals out with 2018. So just some extra information there for you on this one. I will mention for the first generation, it's the first couple of years have the lowest sales It's interesting. I don't know why that's actually opposite to what happens with a lot of manufacturers, where it's the launch that actually sees the biggest jump. I think what's probably happened is that it was a brand new car in Volvo's range. They were trying to position it, and Volvo customers were like, well, the XC90 exists, so that's kind of the big SUV. People in that car don't want to step down. People who are in estate vehicles aren't ready to step up, or have got leases on those cars that haven't come up. But as we see in S60 sales, they drop off into 17 and 18, and then when the new model comes in, 19. So interestingly, it looks like a lot of S60 buyers become XC60 buyers. So something to bear in mind if you're looking around this for the first and second generation. As I said, both of these cars do have buyer's guides. So if you're interested, you can click on those ones next. If you've enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. And I do always like to hear from you as to what we should put up next. I do have quite a lot of plans and a lot of requests, so bear with me if you do put one down there. But I hope that these videos do help you a little bit, especially added in with the buyer's guide, so you can kind of look at both and think, okay, this is what they're saying here, and this is what it says on the buyer's guide as well. Have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.